Hey everyone, this is Christopher Paolini here once again, and today I'm going to be talking about writing with none other than the awesome Marie Brennan. Thanks for being here, Marie.
Thank you for having me.
So why don't you tell viewers what you've written, what you've done, and we'll start from there.
Pretty much everything I've written is fantasy, barring some short stories that have been sold as more kind of dark fantasy horror. Novel-wise, started out with a duology, the Doppelganger series, that are kind of fairly standard, like adventure fantasy. I have an unfinished urban fantasy trilogy, or I should say in progress, the Wilders series, and then a historical fantasy series, the Onyx Court, that is 4 books long. And then the Memoirs of Lady Trent are the thing that I am the most known for. That's my most recent series. And they're kind of a, like, alternate Victoriana pulp adventure science romance kind of thing.
So how would you categorize your books as a whole? Are they shelved in the adult section, the young adult section?
Yeah, everything I've done so far has been adult, though I do have some young adult ideas that I'm poking away at. The memoirs, we've described them to people as young adult friendly. They were published for adults. They're shelved in that section, but I have a lot of emails from people saying, oh, I gave this to my 10-year-old daughter and she loved it, that kind of thing. There's nothing in them that you wouldn't want to give to a younger kid.
Before we go any further, I have to take the opportunity to just rave a little bit and embarrass you. I just read the first Lady Trent book, A Natural History of Dragons, which not only has a superb cover, but it's a superb book also.
I love the cover art for this series so much.
It's gorgeous. And I really, really admired your writing style in the book. I thought it was clean and clear. I loved your world building. I think that maybe people who don't try to write fantasy may not appreciate just how difficult a thing you did and that you pulled off so well in that book. The characters were great, the plotting, I mean, there's no slack in the book, and you don't rush through things either. All in all, I really do believe that if someone's trying to learn how to write, they could do a heck of a lot worse than studying your book.
Well, thank you. The thing that always gets me with this series is that when I first had the idea and started noodling around with it, it took about 2 sentences for the voice to click into place. It was just there from the start, and that was always the thing that kind of carried me through the story, is that Isabella's voice, the way that she was telling her story, was such a clear thing for me. And I realized, because I know you're interested in talking about craft, the things that you can get away with when you're doing this kind of first-person, explicitly retrospective narration, where it's somebody who knows that they are telling their story to an audience, the tricks that lets you pull, and I didn't even realize this until I got into writing it, but anytime that I wanted to do exposition, I could have her say, well, you young people won't realize this because it was many years ago, but if I wanted to describe, like there's a bit in the second book where she goes down into this jungle region, and there's like 3 or 4 paragraphs of me just describing the jungle to you. And I can get away with this because everything that you write in that style of narration is also characterization. Everything is so processed through the narrator's voice and their point of view that even if I'm telling you about a jungle, you're also learning about her at the same time. And it's really powerful to work with, actually.
Well, and to that point, it also lets you skip things that you might be forced to show if you were doing in like limited third-person style writing. For example, and I think we should accept that this conversation is going to have spoilers if anyone hasn't read the book. Just,
I'll try to avoid the worst.
Yeah, we'll try to avoid the worst. But for example, in the book, the main character gets married, and she, of course, sleeps with her husband. And in a story that's told from third person that's really following the character, that's the sort of thing that tends to be a major character moment, and you can tell it is for her, but she, being a classy lady who's not afraid to, break the rules when she has to, but she doesn't dwell on it in any great detail, and that's something you couldn't do if it were third person.
Yeah, and there's a moment in the 5th book, this won't be a spoiler, I do have a line in there that's basically, and then we traveled across this region to get to where we were actually going, and in any other circumstances, that would have been a thrilling tale, but I'm going to skip over it and get to the part that is, relevant to this story. And it's fun to be able to pull tricks like that of like, yeah, and then we had to run away from bandits and moving on. Because you don't want to do it all the time, but tossing that in there every so often is just a really fun trick of like, and then there's this exciting story I'm not telling you. It adds a certain feeling of verisimilitude. But then at the same time, like you said, she's a classy lady. There's things she isn't saying. Because she's writing her memoirs, she knows she's talking to an audience. And so there is the kind of self-editing that I have to take into account while I'm writing it. And in the fourth book, beat that I looked at and I thought, oh, audiences are really going to want more out of this. And so I kind of put in some white space in between the paragraphs I'd written, and I wrote another paragraph, and I sat there and I looked at it, and then I deleted it. So I'm like, she wouldn't write that. And so it doesn't work for everybody, the very kind of Victorian voice to it. There's points where the only way for me to do it and stay true to that is to be understated and to kind of say, okay, this very emotional thing happened, and try to do it in a way that invites the reader to fill in what was going on there rather than putting it all out on the page the way that you might in a third person limited kind of style.
Which is the difficult thing to pull off, because you run the risk of the character coming across as detached to the reader, and I think you balance that nicely. Everything you're saying it's very obvious to me when I read the book how much thought you put into it. And we had a chance at it was Denver Comic-Con last year. We were on a panel together and we got to have some conversations, and it also really struck me that you're not doing any of this by accident. You know why you're trying to do this stuff, and that really stands out in the work. So I wanted to ask you, just backing up a little, so how did you get into writing in the first place, and how did you then learn how to write?
So getting into writing, I kind of think that most kids make up stories, right? It's just kind of a natural part of being a kid. There probably are some who don't, but on the whole, I think we all start out with that tendency. But what cemented it for me, I can actually pinpoint with remarkable specificity. I was 9 or 10 years old, I don't remember exactly when, and I read Diana Wynne Jones' novel Fire and Hemlock. Now, Diana Wynne Jones was an author. I'd read several of her other books. I'd already imprinted on her in general. But for people who aren't familiar with that book, it's one where it's kind of an urban fantasy, sort of a retelling of the Scottish border ballads Tamlin and Thomas the Rhymer, but it's more the kind of thing where it's taking those ideas and doing another story of that type, so it's not a direct retelling. And in it, the two main characters are actually writing a story together. Like, this is long enough ago that they're mailing packets of paper through the post to each other as they add onto this like epic fantasy thing that they're writing. And I remember putting that book down and thinking, I want to be a writer. And it wasn't the first time I'd had the impulse to make up stories, but it was the first time I had thought about doing it for an audience, of wanting to tell stories and have other people read them. And so I was about 9 or 10 when I decided I wanted to be a novelist. And I never let go of that, basically. For the learning to write part, that was really very ad hoc. I actually never took a creative writing class, a fact which I admitted to the students in the first creative writing class I taught at the end of the semester. I was like, by the way, now that we've gone through the whole semester together, I never took one of these classes. I was making this up as I went along. Yeah. So I never took a course. I did a couple of like one-day workshops and things like that. But mostly it was just I gave the things I was writing to friends that I trusted and, got some feedback. It wasn't until I got to college where my science fiction group had a writers group within that. And so I started actually bringing things in more regularly for critique.
And did you find that helpful?
Yeah, the biggest thing that was helpful about it, honestly, was having the accountability of, I said I was going to bring something this week, so I'd better finish it. That was the most important part of it for me, because in kind of the basic tool set of the skills you need to be a writer, the last one that I acquired was finishing what I started. I was writing perfectly good sentences and like decent characterization and like nice description. Not great, but like competent. And I did all of those things before I got to the point where I would actually finish what I was doing.
Which is actually kind of backwards. For most people do it the other way. They write a 400-page manuscript and only then start figuring out, how do I actually put these sentences together in a way that makes sense?
Yeah, I don't know why, but finishing things was my last basic skill in the tool chest.
And now it doesn't seem to be a problem for you now. I mean, you've published how many novels now?
Enough that I have to stop and count. I think it's 13.
13. Wow. Wow. So okay. So then let's move forward a little. What is your actual writing process like these days? Do you use a computer?
Oh, yeah.
Do you plot things out beforehand? Just process. Let's talk about technique a little.
Okay. So, well, as we were mentioning in email while scheduling this call, I'm a night owl. It's been true since I was about 12 that my best hours start at about 10 p.m. So I'm very fortunate that these days I am a full-time writer, largely due to my husband being employed in the tech industry. So he makes the income that allows us to have financial security. So I write full-time. I can set my own hours, and those are mostly late at night. I am not much of an outliner. The way it's evolved a little bit over time, and the way that I describe it working now is it's like there's a big open field ahead of me, and there's a few things that I know I want to have happen in the book. And so I like go out into that field, and about halfway across the field, I hammer in a peg. And then, like maybe three quarters or so, I hammer in another peg. And then as I write, it's okay, I'm going to have to steer a course that will eventually get me to that peg. And I don't really know what it is. I make that up as I go along. I can actually give a specific example from the second book in the memoirs, The Tropic of Serpents. It was a completely random thing. My husband sent me a picture of, it's a portion of Iguazu Falls, which is on the border of, I think, Argentina and another country. I forget. I always forget where this is.
Okay, I have to interrupt just very briefly because the name of that waterfall actually inspired a major location name in my own Inheritance Cycle books. Way back in the day.
So you know what I'm talking about. Yeah, yeah. So my husband sends me this picture of this waterfall, and it was a portion because it's this huge extended series of falls, and it's a portion where there's like an island kind of sticking out through the waterfall with the water going around it. And I was like, oh, that's gorgeous. I need a location like this in the book. Mm-hmm. I don't know what it's going to do. I don't know why my characters are going there. I have no justification for this except it's pretty and I want it. So, okay, one of the things that got hammered out in the field somewhere is they need to go to a waterfall island. All right. And then it was the process of figuring out, okay, why do they need to go there? What's going to be going on? Why is this relevant? Right. And so I made up the answers to that as I went. And that's the closest I come to outlining. Is I want to hit this target. I don't know how to do it, so let's make up the answers that will get me there.
How are you actually doing that, figuring out? I mean, is it you sitting at the computer with the blinking cursor there and you just sitting there until thinking about it till you get it, or are you writing multiple rough drafts and then winnowing down?
It used to be, well, so going back to the whole finishing things was the last skill I acquired. Part of my problem used to be that I wrote things out of order. I would come up with a scene that I was really excited about and I would write it, and then eventually I would try to stitch those things together, and that never worked as well as I wanted it to because like I would write the scene and it would be some emotional moment, but I hadn't really done the groundwork for why are the characters having that emotional moment. And then in writing my way to it, I would often kind of take the straightest line to that destination. And so the bridging material was very blatantly bridging material, right? It was not pulling its own weight. So what ended up being the key for me in finishing stuff was making myself go in order and not hop around like that. But I could write down notes and say, I want to have this thing happen and here's a lot of detail, but not write the scene itself. And instead I would just kind of make myself wait until I got there and write my way to it. And usually by the time I got to it, it had changed, right? It would have evolved based on the things I didn't know I was going to be adding into the story. But then more recently that has started to change a little bit. Because I still write relatively clean drafts, first drafts, compared to some people I know who will literally write a first draft and then check it out and start over because that's their process. I still do keep most of what I write in the original draft, but there is more backtracking, more ripping things out than there used to be. And actually, the current book that I'm doing is very unusual because it's basically a standalone sequel to the memoirs. It takes place around the time that Isabella was writing her memoirs, and the main character is her granddaughter. And I'm doing it as more of a mosaic novel, the kind of thing where it's like assembled out of different kinds of documents. There's letters characters are sending to each other, there's newspaper articles, there's diary entries. And because of that, there's a lot more of me going, okay, eventually this letter is going to be sent, and I have a clear sense of it, so let me go ahead and write that. And that's going to go, I don't know, 30,000 words from now, somewhere later in the book. And I think I can do that now when I couldn't before because I'm also more willing to go, no, that doesn't fit anymore and throw it out rather than feeling like I wrote it, so I've got to keep it. I'm more willing to revise stuff. But also, I think it's just the nature of this book because it is more of this mosaic of separate pieces being linked together. Then sometimes what I need to do is figure out what that later piece is and then go, oh, so clearly having written that, I need to set up these other things first. But figuring those out, I try not to just sit in front of the blinking cursor because that rarely results in good things.
I asked that because that's what always dissuaded me from approach like yours, because I find if I outline things fairly substantially beforehand, when I sit down, it's like I've already composed the piece of music, now I just need to perform it. And if I don't, I almost get seduced into the flow of the words and just following the words, and sometimes the words are because I'm so concentrated on the language and saying things, I stop focusing on what the characters should be doing or who they are or where we're going. At least personally, it ends up leading me astray, or I just sit there doing plotting work thinking, where am I going? And then I'm not writing.
Yeah. I get that. And actually, with what you said of following the words, I did have to rein myself in occasionally with the memoirs because I have a tendency to talk about Isabella as a person because when you're dealing with that kind of first-person narration, it's hard not to think of them in those terms. So I'm not actually delusional. I know my character isn't real. But she would just go off on these digressions about things, and a lot of the digressions stay in there because that's part of the value of that voice. But also there are times where I'm just like, and we have completely left the plot behind. We should back up. But for me, if I outline, well, partly it's that if I try to decide what's going to happen without having done all of the detail work in between, then I miss those opportunities for it to really be embedded in what went before. And also, it takes the excitement out of it for me that you said it's like you've already composed the music, now you just need to play it.
Right.
And I just have this feeling of I'm doing paint by numbers if I've already figured out the whole plot, and then there's not that feeling of excitement and discovery. And if I'm not feeling that, I kind of feel like my reader won't either. So yeah, figuring out where I'm going with the story, that, and this is true of a lot of people, and there's actually neuroscience to back up this approach. It's in the shower or washing dishes or driving somewhere or lying in bed waiting to go to sleep, which I'm really actually bad at. My husband falls asleep at the drop of a hat. I will lie there for quite some time. But when I'm doing other things, often I'll just kind of be, noodling around in the back of my head. And it really is like scientifically true that there's a state of mind you can be in where part of your attention is devoted to something that's not super hard. And then the rest of your mind is free to just kind of drift and play around with ideas. And that's often when you make the more kind of subconscious intuitive linkages. So if I'm stuck on something, it's often much more beneficial to go for a walk or like clean the house. My office is never so clean as when I am stuck on something.
I should show you how clean my office is right now.
Mine's a bit messy, which is odd because I have been struggling with the current bit of plot, but yeah. So yeah, that's how I approach it.
If you're not then outlining in great detail before you sit down, but I'm getting the sense you have a clear idea of ultimately where you want to be, and as you're going throughout your stuff during the day, you're figuring out what the next few pages, what the next chapter is going to be, and all of that. So when you sit down to write, it's not just a completely open question of what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah, I think this is a metaphor I just came up with now, but the THX thing where it's like all these notes that, kind of come in and coalesce into the chord?
Yes.
That's what it's like. Is I've got a bunch of notes, and some of them drop away, and a few others come in, and then they kind of work their way back and forth until they come together. So I don't have a super clear sense, but as I go together into what I need it to be.
Gotcha. Now, so that as far as outlining, yes, but then I'm also wondering, when you sit down to write a story, do you already have a good sense of who the characters are?
Ish. Certainly the main character, I need to know a decent amount about them, or I don't really know enough to start writing. But a lot of it is still a discovery kind of thing for me. And in fact, in many cases, the best ideas that I have are the ones that mug me as I'm going along. They're the things I didn't plan for. This actually happened in the very first novel that I had published. I knew that I was building up to a particular kind of confrontation where the main character was going to say to somebody like, "No, I didn't do what you told me I had to do, but that's because when I got there, I realized the following things, and you can't understand that because you've never been in this situation." And that other character, it was the weirdest feeling, like, because it was my subconscious doing all the work here. It was like the character just looked up at me off the screen and said, "Wrong." And I'm like, oh my God, you did go through that. And oh, that means this other thing here. And I don't even know what the ending of that book would have been if that moment hadn't happened, because the resolution of the conflict ended up hinging on the fact that this secondary character had, in fact, been through the exact same thing and made a different choice. So, that kind of stuff I do discover along the way. But yeah, I don't know. Characters are the most difficult thing for me to really articulate how they happen in my head, because it's just kind of, they come together, not good at externalizing that.
No, that makes sense, and it has to feel right, because it has to feel right to you and it has to feel right to the readers.
Right. Yeah, if it's something where they do a thing because I decided the plot requires them to do it, that's not going to end well.
So I've actually been holding off on asking the question I've been looking forward to the most for this whole conversation, and I think you know what it is. So let's talk about world building now. And actually, it does seem to me that with world building, you do need to work out a lot beforehand, because you don't want to be discovering something about your world 3/4 of the way through a book and suddenly realizing, oh, that changes everything, and I have to rewrite the history of my land. That does happen sometimes, but it's best to avoid that if possible. And I was very impressed with the world building in A Natural History of Dragons, as I said. So how do you go about world building, and what's your general philosophy with that?
Well, so for the memoirs, it's a little bit different because it's not set in the real world, but as you can probably tell looking at it, it's meant to be very analogous to our world. Like, Scairland, the country that Isabella comes from, is very much Victorian England, except everybody's Jewish. Like, it's got these kinds of changes in there. The country she goes to is basically Romania, but they're living under kind of Russian overlords. The second book, she goes to kind of West African savanna and then down into more Central African jungle. Third book, it's like Polynesia, so there's clear analogs where I had people ask why I did that. Why didn't I just set it in the real world? And the answer is that there's also this kind of historical layer. I was like, okay, I'm going to write a pulp adventure type of thing. What are pulp adventure tropes? I need ancient ruins. I need mysterious ancient ruins and an undeciphered language, because that kind of thing is cool. I was an archaeologist. Like, I want my archaeology in here. So there was this world-spanning ancient civilization, and I'm looking at it going, I can't just drop that into real-world history and then pretend the world is going to look anything like it did in our reality. So that's why it's a secondary world. But that also freed up some room for me to do things like saying, yeah, the majority religion in my Europe equivalent is Judaism, because why not? And it's a split between a more kind of temple-based Judaism that kind of occupies the role of Catholicism in real European history, and then a rabbinical form that's more your Protestant kind of Reformation. So I could do things like that. Or the third book, when they're in the kind of Polynesian area, one of the things that I knew I wanted to include, because I just sort of have my anthropological wish list of things you don't see very often in novels, and why not? There's a third gender in that society, people who are considered to be neither male nor female, and there's a third gender character who plays a role in the story, and that added a whole layer of stuff to the culture of me going, okay, what is this third gender? How do these people conceptualize what makes you belong to it? What role do you play onto that gender? So yeah, it gives me room to add in things. Whereas if it's something that's purely a secondary world, because I kind of refer to the memoirs as like world and a half. It's not the real world. It's not quite a secondary world. It's halfway in between. Secondary world, it's... in some ways, it's like the way that I think Tim Powers writes novels. I don't know if you've read any of his work.
No, I'm familiar with them, but I haven't read them.
Yeah. So he does... generally like historical fantasy, and as near as I can tell, the way that he plots his novels is by coming up with 3 or 4 really cool unrelated things and smashing them together until a plot falls out. Like On Stranger Tides is basically zombies and the Fountain of Youth and pirates and puppetry. Sure, let's make a thing out of that. Or there's one that is like the Fisher King, the Turkish invasion of Vienna, and the brewing of beer. That's the drawing of the dark. Like, so it's a little bit like that in that I will go, ooh, here's this thing that I like the idea of. And so, yeah, that actually gives me some ideas for a plot that would interact with that thing. And then here's this other cultural detail that, yeah, that would work reasonably well with this. So let me, stick those together. And I just kind of put together building blocks. And then much like with the plotting, I kind of look at the spaces between them and go, if both of these things exist here, then what other stuff needs to be there for that to make sense? If that makes sense.
I agree. I completely agree with you. And I'm not going to name any particular works here, but I've certainly read fantasy novels where you do have a fantastical element dropped in the real world, and it works for that story. But if you really start thinking about, what would actually the implications? Well, if this element had existed throughout human history, the world we would be seeing would be so completely different that you can't actually tell the story you're trying to tell in this book because culture and history and everything else would be different.
Yeah, I know. That was one of the things that I saw people saying, because there was some comparisons made to Naomi Novik's Temeraire series, and that one is real world kind of 19th century with dragons, because it's the Napoleonic Wars.
It's Master and Commander with dragons.
Yeah, exactly. It is Master and Commander. And the other thing, because like you said, the implications of stuff, I also wanted the ability to say, okay, if this is 19th century, then colonialism, that's a thing, and that's a thing I have to address. But I also wanted the freedom not to directly replicate the precise balance of power that did exist in our own 19th century. So, for example, the kind of China equivalent in this is a good deal stronger, and the kind of African continent hasn't been screwed over in the same way with regard to like a slave trade. So there is still colonialism going on, but it's not quite as one-sided of a thing as it tended to be in history. Because I didn't want something where it just felt like, I've gotten into discussions with other authors sometimes about this, that on the one hand, if you ignore those problems, then you're kind of erasing them, right, and whitewashing things. But if you just replicate the same dynamic in a fantasy novel, it kind of creates this sense of, oh, that's inevitable, and that's how things had to be. So the ability to imagine alternatives, I wanted that, freedom of movement, basically.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I've been bouncing around the idea of, I actually haven't discussed this before, but I've been bouncing around the idea of writing a sort of a YA Edgar Rice Burroughs-esque pulpy adventure novel, which appeals to me greatly, but I've been sort of running into the exact same problem, because if you write an exactly Edgar Rice Burroughs style adventure these days, you'll be rightly condemned for some of the tropes and elements that he used. And so it's kind of like, how do you have your cake and eat it too? And setting it in a different world is one of the approaches that works.
Setting it in a different world doesn't so much solve the problem as give you freedom to move around in solving the problem, because you can do things like saying, okay, this region, which in reality was, completely devastated by warfare and the slave trade and so forth, you can instead say, well, maybe this, state polity here managed to hold itself together because the factors were a little bit different. And so, then you can have a bit more of a two-sided or even three- or four-sided kind of situation going on there to provide the setting for your pulp adventure.
So I take it you definitely feel that your study of anthropology and folklore has contributed greatly to your writing, then?
Just a little bit.
And do you continue that study in any way? I mean, what do you read to continue feeding your brain in that sense?
Yeah, piles of nonfiction. A lot of it these days is kind of directed in that, like, the last of the memoirs, okay, it takes place in basically the Himalayas. So it was, let me go read about mountaineering and Himalayan societies like Tibet, Nepal, and so on. But I try to also make sure that I read things that are not specifically needed for what I'm writing, because this kind of thing, I think of it as like a compost heap that you just kind of need to keep chucking material on there and let it sit. Let it just kind of sit there for a while and do its thing and turn it over every so often, and then things will start sprouting. And in particular, I actually really love blogs for this, if you follow the right kinds of blogs. Like, there's one that's just called The History Blog that I follow, where the person posts about interesting topics of archaeology or art conservation or, whatever. And because their interests are very wide ranging, one week it's like, and here's something about some like Chinese tomb that was found, and then it's something about like 18th century Dutch portraits, and then it's something about like there was one about the Mayan thing recently.
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard that news. Yeah, the LiDAR mapping down in Guatemala. So because of that, I get exposed to a very broad array of things from different parts of the world, including some that I frankly don't know much about. And so that gives me a lot of the variety that I need to kind of feed my brain and make it so that I don't keep going back to the same sources for ideas.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I've had some similar experiences as well, and some of my best ideas have come from reading things that I would have looked at and said, "This has nothing to do with what I'm writing," and then I read it and go, "Oh, that's really cool. What if X, Y, Z?" And so, yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, there's a book called 1491 by Charles Mann, which basically is a popularization of the most recent few decades of research in like New World archaeology of what was the New World like right before and at the moment of European contact. And I'm reading through it. It's an incredibly readable book. Like I was laughing hard enough I nearly fell off the couch at a couple points, which you don't expect out of nonfiction.
No.
But it got to one thing where it talked about the situation that existed among the Inca right before Pizarro showed up, and why was Pizarro able to take over with a tiny number of men. And so it brings up things like the fact that they'd been hit by what were probably smallpox epidemics long before Pizarro showed up, because those had just spread through the continent. But it also talked about the political thing where the Inca, the emperor, was assumed to be immortal, basically, so that, you know, when he died, he was mummified, and everything that belonged to him continued to belong to his lineage because, you know, he was immortal, right? So things couldn't be taken away. And there were these female mediums whose job was to interpret the wishes of the mummified emperor for people. And that over time, you got more and more of the best land and like property and so on being bound up in these lineages because it all still belonged to this dead emperor. And the paragraph ended with a line of, by the time Pizarro showed up, the Inca had a serious mummy problem. I'm just like, I want to do something with that. Like, the Inca had a serious mummy problem. This is, how do you not make a story out of that? You know?
Well, you know, the weird thing is, and I'd be curious if you agree with me, is so the more I learn about history and archaeology, anthropology, and all, the more I learn about the world. In the first stages of that, I felt like it was constraining. It's like, oh, well, if I want to make a realistic feeling culture world, you know, there are certain things you have to do. There are certain things you can't get around. But I also feel like the more I learn about human history, the weirder it gets.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I think actually a lot of fantasies undersell the uniqueness of various human cultures and the crazy things you can do and actually have them be completely believable.
Yeah, the thing that I love most about anthropology, and I should say I did not choose my college and grad school majors by going, what would be best for me as a fantasy writer? I just landed on that answer by accident because it was anthropology and folklore, and those are really, really helpful for fantasy. And yeah, the more widely you read, the more you realize that the things you take for granted as just being natural and the way society works are actually very culturally constructed. There's nothing inevitable about them. There are certain things that you kind of can't get around. Like you have, you know, a society without agriculture, unless you're in a region like the Pacific Northwest, you're not going to be able to get big like cities and settlements and sedentary populations. You just can't support that on hunting and gathering unless it's the Pacific Northwest. So, you know, you find these rules and then you find the exceptions to them.
And from a storytelling standpoint, you'll find, you know, coming of age rituals in pretty much every early culture. You know, there are some universalities there as well.
Yeah, though they're universal in ways that aren't constraining, right? It's like, yes, a coming of age ritual, but what age that happens at, what the process of going through that rite of passage is, what the effect is once you've gone through it, that's a completely open field. You just have this very simple idea of there is a ritualized transition, and that, you know, you can generate anything you want out of that. And so, yeah, the more that you think, oh, well, you know, this would never fly, then you read about something in the past or in another part of the world and you go, that is every bit as unusual and off the wall to what we're accustomed to. So why shouldn't this idea I came up with work? Plus, I do think that in fantasy, you get at least one just kind of like freebie on your world building. Like for the memoirs, it's, I have my character, she's a scientist, she studies things in an organized fashion. How do my dragons fly? I wave my hands a little bit and I go, well, their bones are special and there's these little like valves in the wings, so there's less resistance when it goes up and it closes when it goes down, and it sounds good. It doesn't work.
Oh, I loved the valves. I loved the valves in the wings. I literally put the book down and had to go tell everyone what a clever idea it was.
Thank you. But yeah, so I mean, and not even just the flying, actually, that's what everybody's mind goes to. But I do also look at this and go, how many large obligate carnivores do I have in this land area, and how exactly are they staying fed? Don't ask. The dragons are just kind of the gimme in this book. So I do think you can have the occasional thing in your story where you're like, yeah, it doesn't really work.
Yeah.
But that's okay, because this is the shiny thing at the heart of the story, and I'm allowed to just kind of let that one go.
I just suddenly had an idea for a fantasy world where the dragons are actually herbivores.
That would be much more plausible.
It would.
Oh god, especially you could do something with like the fermentation of the vegetable matter creates like lifting gas or something, helps them fly.
Can also be used for breathing fire too, if you're getting hydrogen or something out of it. Well, some of what you're talking about with world building reminds me of. I don't know if you've ever read much Jack Vance.
No, he's like one of those kind of classic authors that I just keep not picking up the books because there's so many books on the read pile.
He's not great on larger story structure. He's definitely more of a short story writer. And he has this skill where he'll be going along in his story and he will give you like one paragraph or two paragraphs describing an imaginary civilization of one type or another that the character is traipsing past, and he'll just build this amazing civilization or culture in just a paragraph or two, and then he'll never mention it ever again. But he was so darn imaginative in doing that, it's almost worth it reading through and going, wow, that's cool, I'd love to read a whole book about that culture, but he's already on to the next idea.
Yeah, I actually, for me, it was Sarah Monette's Doctrine of Labyrinth series is kind of what gave me that feeling. And it made me a real fan of what I kind of refer to as gratuitous world building. It's the kind of thing where if you look at how we actually talk and, look at like Renaissance plays or whatever, they are full of allusions to historical events, historical people, other, stories, plays, novels, poems, whatever, pieces of music that are just a part of people's worlds. And so they mention them in passing and don't stop and explain it. And Monette does that really, really well in the Doctrine of Labyrinths, where there will be, some reference to like a famous poisoner, and she doesn't stop for a paragraph to tell you about that poisoner and who they killed and why, because it doesn't matter. It's just the kind of reference that somebody would drop in. And it makes the world feel much more real. And the fun thing with it is that you can get away with just going, here's a shiny thing, and then not actually explaining it all. And if somebody asks you, you're like, yeah, no, don't ask, because I never actually did figure that out. But it was just there.
Well, and that's a tricky balance to strike also, because you risk overwhelming the reader with a bunch of stuff that they never see again or they don't understand, and it's like diving into a Russian novel with no sense of what's going on, and it takes a while to figure it out. But I really did think that was one of the things I noticed, that you balanced it well, creating the sense of that world that already exists and that you're playing in, and yet without overwhelming the reader with info dumping. And how do you avoid info dumping, since that's one of the great sins of sci-fi fantasy?
I mean, part of it, as I said, with the memoirs is I could get away with info dumping because of the narration style. Like, Isabella can just kind of lecture you about something for a few paragraphs, and she can be entertaining enough about it that you get away. So that is the first answer of just do it so engagingly. Like, go read Neil Stephenson. That man can stop and lecture you about, like, anything for 3 pages, but he'll be so funny while he does it that you don't care, right?
My favorite example was in Cryptonomicon, when he decided to describe pouring milk into a bowl of cereal for about 2 pages. Oh!
Yeah.
I was laughing like crazy, and I couldn't explain to my family why I was laughing.
Yeah, well, and I've told people when I recommend Snow Crash, I'm like, so if you find Sumerian mythology and neurolinguistics and computer hacking to be interesting, then you won't mind when the plot slams to a halt in the middle of the book for like 100 pages for Hero and the Librarian to talk about these things. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that to most people, because you're really playing with fire of, are you going to get away with that or not? But having said that, the other thing that I think is really important and takes a lot of practice but works beautifully when it does is what Joe Walton refers to as incluing. And that's, instead of stopping and saying, I'm going to explain it all here, you just kind of make a mention in this sentence and then another detail, in the next sentence, and things about like the way the characters talk will provide the context that you need. Not an as you know, Bob kind of thing, but well, for example, if you need one character to lecture somebody else about a thing, then you could do the second character doesn't know, and so they need the lecture, but that's a little bit flat. It's much more interesting if they know and they disagree, and now the two characters have an argument. And that gives you the reason to bring in all these details because there's a dispute, there's a conflict. And, even things, it's just like details about the characters getting dressed, right? Let's say you want to explain your fashion style. Rather than stopping for a paragraph to say, here's what the character was wearing, maybe they're getting dressed for some important event and there's a whole lot of, should I wear this? But no, if I do that, it's going to make me look too poor. I need to wear this other thing. But then, wait, I'm running afoul of the sumptuary laws, and you don't have to lecture the reader about the sumptuary laws. You just make it clear that, they might be thought that they're trying to rise above their station if they wear this article of clothing here. So you basically work it into the conflicts and work it into the characters' thoughts and behaviors in a way that, in the long run, gives the reader that context, rather than stopping it.
Finding ways to make it relevant in an emotional way that the reader will care about.
Exactly. Yeah, make it relevant to the emotions, make it relevant to the conflict, and that way you have those opportunities to kind of just like salt in the details. Rather than a whole big block of them, you kind of sprinkle them along the top.
Well, it's like I picked up Dune again recently, just out of curiosity, and I had this mental impression of the book being this incredibly rich, over-described book in a sense, very broad in its scope. And with a little bit more context now, I was actually kind of surprised by how little he describes it. Herbert does exactly what you've been talking about, which is he references a lot of things and then never tells you about them ever again. So you get the sense that it's a big universe, but he's not over-dumping on all the information.
Now, I'll note, this including approach does also require a certain kind of skill from the reader in terms of being able to, follow along with that and kind of hold those details in their mind until they pull together. I remember being at a panel once where Samuel Delaney was talking about the kind of reading protocols and reading skills that you acquire with particular genres. And so he gave some people who didn't read science fiction a science fiction short story to read. And they slammed to a halt on the first sentence, which was something about like the ship cruised past the monopole magnet mining operations on the third moon of Saturn. And they're like, wait, monopole magnets? Don't magnets have two poles? Are they mining with monopole magnets or mining for them? Like, what's going on here? Whereas a science fiction reader is going to say, all right, if that's important, it'll come back later, right? So some of it is that the readers need to be trained in the right protocols of reading. And every genre has this. I'll say that, like, you give somebody who's not a romance novel reader a romance novel, and they'll be like, it's so obvious that these two people are going to end up together. It's like, well, yeah, the point of the novel is not to surprise you with who will end up being hitched at the end. It's what is the process that gets them there,
Yeah, and my experience too is that like sci-fi fantasy, reading those two genres is really good preparation for reading historical novels and vice versa, because especially when there's a large time difference between where we are now and when the novel was written. Because reading a novel set that was written 600 years ago in a different culture, it's like reading about a fantasy world or a science fiction world. The references are so different, the language is different, and I think the skills transfer quite well.
Yeah, the Onyx Court series that I mentioned, the ones that are straight up historical fantasies, they're set in London at different points in English history. Writing the very first one of those was definitely a level up moment for me because it's Midnight Never Come. It's set in the Elizabethan period. And, I kind of vaguely knew Elizabethan England, but I'd never really sat down and read about daily life and the details. And I ended up making a research trip to London for each of these books, which was fantastic, being able to go and see things in person. But I wrote part of Midnight Never Come before I went on this research trip. And I had a scene taking place at Hampton Court Palace, which I knew was one of the royal palaces and one that Elizabeth used a lot. So I wrote the scene of these two characters having a conversation as they just kind of like walk down a corridor and then out onto a balcony, right? Scene setting. So I get to Hampton Court Palace and I look up at the building and there are no balconies. Like, okay. So this is why you actually look at the buildings you're talking about. That's good. And I'd arranged to get a guy who worked at the palace to kind of show me around. He was like an architectural historian. So he talked to me about the changes that have been made in the building since the Elizabethan period, because there were a lot of renovations. And in talking to him, I found out no hallways. Because in the Elizabethan period, rooms just opened directly onto one another. They didn't have these interstitial spaces. I'm like, oh, I never would have even thought of that because I just take hallways for granted. Of course, we have rooms opening off of these corridors. So yeah, I had to completely change the setting of this scene because I had them walking through architecture that didn't exist. And that's my kind of go-to example of the things that I became alert to because of doing the historical research, that now when I go to write something that's secondary world, the number of things I take for granted is much smaller. And actually, I try not to take anything for granted. Even if I end up keeping the kinds of details we're familiar with, I try to have that moment where I stop and think, wait, do I want to go with what I assume here, or is this a place where it would be interesting to change it up? And I'm much more alert to that because of history.
So what do you think are some of the major world-building problems that aspiring authors often make, or mistakes that they often make?
That is a really difficult question to answer at anything resembling short length. I mean, basically, the only short answer I can give is the biggest mistake is to assume that what you're familiar with is the way things always work, right? And that applies to anything. That could be clothing, that could be food, that could be weather, that could be architecture, it could be government, whatever. There are so many things that I've wanted for a long time to write some kind of book about world building, some sort of, how-to writer's guide thing. And I keep running aground on this is just such a huge topic because not only are there 8 million aspects to culture, but all of them are interconnected. And so you kind of can't start talking about one thing without talking about another thing. And you start out talking about art and wind up on sanitation somehow, and you're not even sure what the steps were that got you there. Which is why actually I have found a way to approach this, which is to just kind of let it be at length. About a year ago, I started running a Patreon specifically about world building. And the reason that ended up being the solution is I make one post a week and it'll just be on something that is kind of a post-sized topic. And maybe I'll chain together like a month's worth, like February, I'm talking about marriage. So like who gets married, how, like what is required for you to get married, different structures of marriage, like monogamy, the different kinds of polygamy, because there's polygyny, which is multiple wives, polyandry, multiple husbands, dowries, bride prices, that kinds of thing, divorce, how does divorce happen? When is it allowed to happen? And then I'm putting those together. I'm actually going to have an ebook out probably in April. That'll be the first year of that because this has been going for a year and I'm not done. I'll probably have at least 3 years of this in me at the rate things are going, which is why I say there's really not a short answer to that. Like it's taking me at least 3 years and possibly more to answer that question.
Well, and I should say I went to your website and I looked at some of the articles you have there on writing. And I was very impressed with the clarity of your thoughts on this and the various things you had to say. So, yeah, if anyone's interested in your thoughts on world building, definitely check out your Patreon or your website and all of that. As far as the world building stuff, it does seem to me a lot of it boils down to the simple practice. I say simple, but it's not simple, of asking questions. And then trying to answer them as honestly as possible. I've talked about this in other interviews. One of the things that drives me up the wall, and this is a simple example, is, for example, there's a movie in the 1950s, and I forget the name of it, with Ava Gardner, and basically this mannequin comes to life in a store, and it's Ava Gardner, and she's the daughter of Zeus. And, of course, she ends up meeting a guy in the real world, and they fall in love, and, it's this romance story. But not once during the entire movie does the guy stop and say, wait a minute, you mean Zeus is real? Think of the theological implications here. It's like there's this massive thing hanging over the story, and the writers just completely ignore it.
I ran into something like that with the movie Stranger Than Fiction, which I don't know if you've seen it. It's kind of a comedy with, Will Ferrell, I think.
And Emma Thompson.
Where she's a novelist and he's basically like one of her characters that he starts hearing this voice kind of like narrating his life, and it turns out that what she's writing is controlling his life in some fashion. And it drove me a little bit up the wall because it's not a fantasy story. And I mean that in the sense of like genre as conversation. It's not talking to the fantasy genre because it is completely uninterested in the question of why is this happening? Mm-hmm. Like, Is what she is writing being shaped by his life, or is she writing and controlling his life? What's the causality there?
Yeah.
All the questions that a fantasy reader immediately leaps to, the movie is just not concerned with. That's not what it's doing.
And what happens if she actually writes about an actual fantastical character, like, an undead pirate of some kind? Does that mean that she just created the
Yeah.
undead pirate off in the wilderness somewhere and he's going to be controlled by her? Yeah, it's
Yeah, or could she make an undead pirate, suddenly leap out of nowhere and attack the character? We don't know because the movie is doing other things. Um, so yeah, it's some of it is asking yourself the questions of, okay, if I put this in here, then what does that mean? I actually ran into this with my first published novel. It was originally called Doppelganger. It's now just called Warrior. Um, I had this setup of, okay, the witches that exist in this setting, they go through a certain kind of test, and the ones who fail the test basically don't become witches, they become what they call cousins, and they're kind of servants to the witches. And I came up with the idea for this novel when I was about 17. I wrote the novel when I was 19, sold it when I was about 24, and I wrote a sequel. I'm writing the sequel when I'm like 25, based on an idea I had 8 years before. I'd grown a fair bit as a writer since then, and I looked at Cousins and went, well, that's messed up. Like, I didn't really think that through when I was 17, 18, 19 years old, but now I look at it and go, huh, okay, so they just, become your, like, slave labor or something? I mean, what's going on here? So I was able to make plot out of looking at my own world building and going, I just created a really big issue there. Uh, but yeah, kind of taking a moment to step back and look at stuff and go, what are the implications of this?
So, along that lines, what are some things you wish you knew when you were starting out that you know now about writing and world building?
Ah, that's a good question. Because again, the answer to that is long. Because my writing was really shaped by my undergrad and graduate education in anthropology, just being exposed to so many ideas, and I wish I'd had that richness of experience sooner. Which, that's always a thing with writing. Of as you learn more things, as you do more in your life, hopefully you internalize that and incorporate it into your writing. Um, I mean, I think a part of it is just being more aware of the scale of difference that is out there, rather than kind of going with a standard, vaguely medieval Renaissance-ish, European-ish kind of default. And I mean, even with
it's
that,
fun to write about.
it is fun to write about, but there's, in particular, what I'm finding myself more and more fond of doing is having different cultures intersecting. Like, I've noticed the last three ideas I've come up with all take place in like port cities or the end of a long, like, trade road or something like that, or some kind of context where instead of just having, here is the setting and my, here's the culture and my story takes place in it, it's here's these people and then this is the society that conquered them about 200 years ago. So now you kind of have different strata in this society and they're trading with this other country over here. So you've got that foreign influence coming in. I'm finding myself really gravitating toward that because then it's not a monoculture. I get the kinds of contrasts and conflicts that can come up when I have these different things running into each other. And I'm finding myself really enjoying working with that right now.
Well, variety is interesting, I think, and that applies to, the pacing of a story, the characters. I mean, every level of fiction, I think you can say, and art in general, you can say variety, it's interesting.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that I've become more aware of over time, and I actually owe this a little bit to my background in role-playing games, there was a long-running LARP, a live-action game that I played in, which every so often would have these kinds of, like, high politics sessions where it was all the high muckety-mucks of the society that our normal characters live in get together to do things. And so we would play different characters for those one-shots. And the way that the people who were running this game set it up was they would build it around, like, factions. And so your character would belong to a particular faction that had certain goals. And what that meant was, instead of trying to create a plot, it was more like they tried to create fertile ground for the plot to generate itself. That if you get these different people who have different resources and different goals and different like attitudes towards each other, then just letting those bounce off one another will make stuff happen. And I now think about that on a world building level as well. Do you know the Dragon Age games at all?
Of course.
Yeah, I love Dragon Age, and one of the things that they did really...
And if you haven't played them, I'd highly recommend their sci-fi series Mass Effect also.
I started Mass Effect, I had issues with the gameplay. So
Yeah, I tell everyone, if you start Mass Effect, the first like 2 hours suck. And then you get into the story deep enough that you can kind of forgive the gameplay stuff because the story's more interesting enough.
Yeah. There were too many things about the gameplay. What I want to do is just have a friend like play through the game for me while I watch. But anyway,
Anyway,
yeah. So Dragon Age, the thing that they did really, really well with that franchise is they knew it was going to be a franchise, right? They knew they weren't just making one game. And so your central conflict there is you've got this invasion of monsters called the Darkspawn, you know, it's this blight, and you have to pull people together to fight it, right? But that is not the only conflict in the setting. You've also got the fact that, like, you've got the elves as an oppressed underclass, you've got the mages versus Templars, you have the Kunari invasion, you have religious heresies, you have all the internal politics of the dwarves, you have all these different things going on. And it means that when it comes time to generate more stories in that setting, you're not having to, like, lay down track right in front of the train. And so if you build your world in a way that has this kind of depth and complexity and richness to it, if you have, you know, these 2 or 3 cultures that are intersecting and you take some time to think about the religion, even though the story's not about the religion, then you get these moments where you go, oh, I need to have some kind of plot complication happen here. I could just use that thing right over there. And it's already there for you. And it'll add details to the conflicts that you're putting in there so that they don't play out in the most straightforward fashion. They end up developing little twists and turns. So that, I think, if I can pull out one thing to be kind of I wish I'd thought of this sooner, was if you do that groundwork beforehand, then it ends up contributing massively to the characterization, to the plot, to all kinds of things, and making it all feel more organic.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with that, and I think I've certainly learned over the years that there are no shortcuts. You have to put the legwork in one way or another. You're either going to do it before you write the manuscript, or you're going to do it after you write the manuscript and realize the manuscript isn't working, and you have to figure out all these different things and then rewrite the darn thing. There is no shortcut.
Some of it will happen on the fly, right? Like, because it can turn into procrastination. You're like, oh, I can't start writing the novel yet because I haven't built the entire world. You're never going to build the entire world. You need to just put in place enough material to kind of get yourself rolling and make sure you have the major pieces there. And then later you go, oh, it'll be really interesting if I added in this, like, twist on the religion. Like, maybe instead of just saying there is this religion, maybe there's some kind of, like, schism within it, or, you know, competing philosophies, and so you can have 2 characters who follow slightly different strands of the religion. It feels more real because most religions are not monolithic. And then you also get that, you know, added richness and a layer in your plot.
You do kind of need to, maybe you disagree, but I think also you do need to start from first principles in an imaginary world, whether that's the culture, the religion, the different aspects of even the physical world itself. And for example, with a religion, saying, okay, what is their philosophy on a very, very basic level? And then everything else is just trappings. Everything else sort of comes from that. You know, the schism might be a difference of belief in that basic philosophy. And if you don't have that, that's the sort of thing where trying to come up with it after the fact, I think, can be very difficult.
It can be hard.
You know, Fertile Ground would be a good name for your world-building book.
It's New Worlds is the name of the Patreon, and so I'm going to title the book that to maintain the continuity
New
of branding
Worlds.
there, both. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, is there anything else you'd like to say about world-building or writing?
Yes, but it would go on for like 3 hours, and we don't have the time for that, so I think this will do for now.
I know, I'm biting back like another 10 questions here, because we could be here all day.
Yeah, pretty much.
Awesome. Well, this was an awesome conversation. I feel like I learned some stuff. I hope our viewers did as well. As I said at the beginning of this interview, I am a big fan of this book, and I'll be reading more books from you. They're on their way from Amazon, even as we speak. And I encourage everyone who's an aspiring writer to check out your work also.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for agreeing to do this interview today.
I appreciate you setting it up.
My pleasure. All right, thanks for watching, guys. We'll be back again. I'll be back again before too long.